I only needed somewhere to sleep. I never knew this old workshop was waiting for me.
She was 20 and homeless. No room, no family willing to take her, no safe place to sleep. Just one worn winter coat and $3 she had hidden beneath its lining. And with those $3, she bought a forgotten tin cookie-cutter workshop outside Lancaster, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a place dropped from county maps in 1971. The north sill had rotted nearly through. Half the chimney bricks moved under one hand. The county condemned the workshop on October 14th, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside an enormous coal-heated soldering iron lay an oak handle with a sealed hollow core, unopened for decades, holding what would alter the shape of June Keller's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. June Keller had been cutting away excess her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned early that broken things were rarely thrown out in her family. Bent lampshades were straightened, loose chair joints were steamed apart and glued again. A cracked tin bread box might sit on the kitchen table for 3 Saturdays while someone decided whether its metal had enough honesty left in it to save. June liked that patience. She liked the idea that damage was information. Her father, Thomas Keller, had been a quiet man who repaired old household goods for estate dealers around York and Lancaster. He smelled of machine oil, coffee, and wool even in July. He taught June to hold a tool lightly enough to feel what it was doing. When he died before her 15th birthday, the house became louder without anyone raising a voice. On weekends after that, June rode 2 buses to her grandfather Elias Keller's workshop near Littitz. Elias was a retired tinsmith with a left thumb flattened by 50 years of hammers. Every Saturday he set 2 mugs of weak coffee beside the bench, one for himself and one mostly filled with milk for June, then handed her narrow strips of tin plate. She learned to cut curves with snips, without leaving teeth in the edge. She learned to draw a strip over a wooden stake until it followed the shoulder of a rabbit or the point of a star. Elias showed her how to fold the upper rim, so no child reaching into a flour bin would open a finger on raw metal. The soldering came last. He heated the copper bit over charcoal until flux whispered against it, then touched solder to a joint so carefully that the bright seam seemed to appear by agreement. June carried that sentence differently as she grew older. Elias had meant tin. She understood that much later. He died during a wet March when June was 17. By the time she reached his shop, relatives had already begun sorting. The forming stakes went to auction. His snips disappeared into a box bought by a dealer from Maryland. The old patterns, some cut from cereal cartons and brown wrapping paper, were thrown away after someone mistook them for rubbish. June found only one bent 6-pointed star beneath a cabinet. She kept it. Her brother Nathan was 7 years older and had inherited their father's talent for sounding certain when he was afraid. After Elias died, Nathan began managing every bill, every signature, every conversation involving the small house their father had left them jointly. He opened mail before June saw it. He moved papers from drawers and said they were safer with him. He spoke of investments, temporary loans, opportunities that would repair everything at once. June noticed men waiting in parked cars twice. Nathan told her not to worry. Then he stopped sleeping at the house. On the morning the last certainty disappeared, June came downstairs and found a red ceramic bowl missing from the hall table. Their mother's keys had always been kept there before she remarried and moved to Ohio. In its place lay a folded notice bearing 3 signatures, 2 legal stamps, and an address June did not recognize. The house had been pledged against private debt. Nathan was gone. At 11:16, a black sedan stopped beside the curb. June stood in the front room, holding the bent tin star, while 2 men entered with paperwork and the calm manners of people who expected obedience. One wore pale leather gloves. He placed a clipboard on her father's piano and looked at June as though she were another object requiring inventory. Her mother arrived 20 minutes later. She had driven from Harrisburg after June called 3 times. June waited for her to object, to make a telephone call, to say Nathan could not have pledged what belonged partly to his sister. Her mother read the notice. Then she folded it once. The man in gloves pointed toward the stairs. June tightened her fingers around the star. "You need to take what you can carry." 8 words. Her mother looked down at the floor. That was the betrayal June remembered. Not shouting. Silence. She packed 1 sweater, 2 shirts, socks, Elias's tin star, and a photograph of her father standing beside a repaired Hoosier cabinet. She put them in a canvas grocery bag because the family suitcase had already been removed. By dusk, the locks had changed. For 6 weeks, June moved through southeastern Pennsylvania by bus, by foot, and sometimes by standing near gas stations until someone offered a ride. The first 4 nights she slept upright in the Harrisburg bus terminal until a guard began recognizing her coat. In Columbia, she spent 2 nights beneath the covered side of a self-service car wash, waking whenever the spray bays started before dawn. She rode to York and slept behind a 24-hour laundromat where warm air leaked through a dryer vent and made 1 square of brick bearable. Her money shrank by quarters. A 79-cent bread roll. A cup of coffee she nursed for 3 hours. A bus fare paid in coins arranged across the counter while the driver waited. At a church shelter, every bed was taken by the time she arrived. At another, she left before sunrise because a woman in the next cot had begun coughing blood into a towel. By the 5th week, June had become exact about public buildings. Libraries opened warm. Hospitals had bathrooms no one questioned if you walked with purpose. Grocery stores sometimes discarded fruit with only 1 bruised side. She washed her socks in sinks and dried them beneath hand dryers. The $3 sewn into the lining of her coat remained untouched. They were not spending money. They were the last thing in her life that had not yet been taken. On a grey afternoon in Lancaster, with rain beginning to freeze against the windows, June entered the public library because she could no longer feel 2 of her toes. She chose a table near a radiator and unfolded the local classified pages left beside a stack of community notices. Most advertisements were ordinary. Room for rent. Walnut dining set. Farm equipment. Then she found a county disposal notice printed in narrow type. Abandoned commercial structure. Former tinware workshop. Parcel transfer subject to condemnation. Minimum cash bid, $3. June read it twice. The location was outside the city, beyond the last regular bus stop. The structure was unsafe. Taxes had been cleared through a county program. Buyer accepted all liability. At the bottom was a filing deadline. That day. She slid 1 finger into the torn seam of her coat lining and touched the folded bills. For 6 weeks, those dollars had meant food she had not eaten, fares she had walked instead, phone emergency she had kept postponing. Now they meant a deed. June copied the address in pencil on the back of a discarded library receipt. Then she stood, buttoned her coat, and began walking toward the county clerk's office before she could become sensible again. By sunset, the last $3 to her name were about to purchase a building no reasonable person wanted. June reached the county clerk's office 12 minutes before closing and left Lancaster the following morning with a deed folded inside a manila envelope beneath her coat. The bus carried her northwest as far as Lititz Pike, where the route ended beneath a grey sky and a wind sharp enough to make her eyes water. From there, the directions on the deed put the workshop nearly 8 miles away by road. She walked 6 before darkness settled over the fields, then slept in the hayloft of an open-sided dairy barn after asking permission from a farmer whose name she never caught. The thermometer nailed beside his milk room read 27-degree Fahrenheit odds. He gave her an old horse blanket. At dawn, frost had silvered the loose hay around her breath. June folded the blanket neatly over a stall rail, drank water from an outside pump, and walked the remaining distance with the canvas grocery bag knocking against her knee. The settlement nearest the property was small enough that the businesses appeared almost all at once. Stoltzfus Hardware behind 2 dusty windows, Miller's Feed Seed with sacks stacked beneath its awning, Doris Bell's Corner Cafe, Weaver Shoe Repair, and Brenner's Market, where a hand-painted sign advertised potatoes by the £50 bag. No one stopped June, but several people watched. The county annex occupied an old brick building beside a former post office. Inside, radiators ticked beneath tall windows, and the air smelled of wet wool and carbon paper. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver hair gathered so tightly at the back of her head that not one strand moved when she looked up. Her nameplate read Margaret Hess, Deputy Clerk. June placed the manila envelope on the counter. Mrs. Hess opened it, removed the transfer papers, and studied June over the rims of narrow glasses. You understand the building is condemned? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair the well, roof, chimney, foundation, or access road? Yes, ma'am. June put both hands flat against the counter. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Hess continued looking at her. June glanced at the deed. Something changed in the clerk's face, but only slightly. She turned the papers around. June signed 7 times. Her handwriting became steadier with each page. Mrs. Hess carried the packet to a side desk, pressed a brass county stamp into a black ink pad, and brought it down with a heavy mechanical click. The sound was final in a way June had not expected. Property had always seemed to belong to people with savings accounts, married names, pickup trucks, and kitchen drawers full of warranties. Now, $3.07 signatures had placed a condemned workshop under hers. Mrs. Hess slid 1 copy across the counter. Take East Newport Road until you pass the old Mennonite cemetery. Turn right at the Split Oak onto Brunnaville Road. You'll see a gravel lane after the second stone bridge. The lane looks private. It isn't. June folded the deed. Mrs. Hess had begun placing the remaining documents into a file when she stopped. June looked up. The clerk opened the deed again. Your family from around Littitz. Elias. Mrs. Hess removed her glasses. For the first time, she looked not at June's coat or the canvas bag, but directly at her face. June said nothing. He made tinware too. Stars, running horses, birds. Christmas cutters mostly. Mrs. Hess leaned back slowly. He apprenticed with a man named Anna Riehl. Did he not? June knew the name only from stories told across Elias's workbench. The clerk tapped 1 finger against the deed. June waited. The radiator clicked behind them. Mrs. Hess turned toward a tall cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and removed an old parcel ledger whose cloth spine had gone brown. She found a page without consulting an index. Amos Riehl Tin and Pattern Works, she read. Transferred through the family until the last owner died. No heirs filed. County took possession after taxes and structural citations. June stared at the paper. Before my time, but people knew it. Mrs. Hess closed the ledger. My father used to say Elias could make a rabbit cutter without drawing the rabbit first. June looked down at the deed she had bought for the price of 3 cheap cups of coffee. She remembered her grandfather bending tin across a maple stake, his flattened thumb pressing the curve rather than forcing it. Mrs. Hess put her glasses back on. Outside. The afternoon had turned colder. June followed the directions on foot. East Newport Road narrowed between farm fields gone brown for winter. A man in a canvas coat passed her driving an old Ford pickup, slowed, then stopped 20 yards ahead. June nodded. The man looked at her bag. "I'll manage." He studied her another moment, touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap, and drove on. A black and white farm dog followed June from the next property for nearly half a mile, keeping to the drainage ditch as though assigned to escort her. At the second stone bridge it stopped, sneezed once, and returned home. Then came the walnut trees. They stood bare along a sunken gravel lane, their trunks dark with damp, branches interlocked above June like old hands. Beyond them waited the workshop. It was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 30 feet long and 18 wide, built of weathered limestone below and timber framing above, with narrow clapboards gone almost silver. The roof sagged toward the north corner. Moss filled the lower shingles. A brick chimney leaned slightly away from the ridge. Above the door, a wooden sign hung from one rusted chain. Most of the paint had vanished. June wiped it with her sleeve. IAAL Tin and Pattern Works. One letter remained deep red. The key from the county envelope resisted twice before turning. The door opened inward 3 inches and stopped against something. June pushed harder. A warped tin tray scraped across the floor. Cold air moved out of the building, carrying the smells of rust. Old wood, mouse nests, mineral dust, and something faintly sharp beneath them all. Flux. She knew it before she had fully entered. The front room had once been the public shop. A long counter leaned toward the floor, and behind it stood shallow drawers with handwritten labels faded almost white. Winter stars, birds, animals, small, fancy. One drawer lay open. Inside was a single tin cutter shaped like a horse. Its hind leg had been crushed flat. June lifted it. The metal was so cold it stung her fingers. Somewhere in the walls, a mouse scratched. Rainwater ticked into a bucket with the patient rhythm of a clock. She tasted dust when she breathed through her mouth. The back room was darker. Her boots disturbed curled shavings and rotten sawdust as she crossed the threshold. Rolls of yellowed tin plates stood bowed against one wall. Wooden forming stakes rose from a bench like worn anatomical shapes, curves for backs, shoulders, wings, points. On another bench lay soldering tools, small copper irons, flux brushes hardened in old jars, a charcoal brazier with one leg missing, and at the far end, beneath a torn canvas cover, an enormous soldering iron unlike any June had seen in Elias's shop. Its copper head was nearly the size of a brick. The handle was dark oak. She put one hand around it. The grip had been worn smooth by somebody who had held it thousands of times. June let go. There would be time. Night came before she could inspect the rest. There was no electricity. The well pump groaned but produced only brown water on the first strokes, so she ate half a roll left from the morning and drank the last water from her bottle. She swept one section of the front room with a broken broom until the floorboards showed. Then she laid flattened cardboard beneath her coat and used the canvas grocery bag as a pillow. Wind entered somewhere above the north wall. The building answered with small sounds. a shingle lifting, a board contracting, metal shifting faintly as the temperature fell. June lay awake watching a narrow stripe of moonlight cross the ceiling. In the house she had lost, silence had meant waiting for Nathan's key in the door, another unopened envelope, another explanation delivered too quickly. Here the silence was different. Nothing was asking her to believe a lie. Before sleep, she reached into the grocery bag and placed Elias's bent six-pointed star beside her on the floor. Outside, the bare walnut branches moved against the stars. Inside, an old workshop stood around her, damaged but still holding its shape. Cut away the excess to find the shape that was truly yours. On the first morning, June learned that ownership did not make anything easier to lift. The well handle fought her for 20 minutes before the water cleared from rust brown to something nearly transparent. She filled 2 enamel buckets she found beneath the counter, boiled one over a borrowed camp stove, and marked the other clean with charcoal on a scrap of wood. The outhouse stood 40 yards beyond the walnut trees, tilted but usable, with a crescent cut into the door and a nest abandoned beneath the seat. By the third day she knew the workshop's sounds. The board beside the front counter complained in 2 notes. A plank near the stove snapped sharply only after sunset. The back room threshold gave one dry click beneath her left heel. Knowing those sounds mattered. At night, she could distinguish the building settling from something moving inside it. On the 4th morning, June walked back toward the village and entered Stoltzfus Hardware. A brass bell struck the door twice. The store smelled of kerosene, leather gloves, seed packets, and the mineral sweetness of galvanized metal. Narrow aisles climbed almost to the pressed tin ceiling. Behind the counter stood a broad man with 1 white eyebrow and 1 brown. As though age had reached only half his face, he was sharpening a carpenter's pencil with a pocket knife. June stopped. That travels quickly. He closed the knife. Walter Stoltzfus. His eyes dropped to her boots, which were dark with mud from the lane. Walter considered this, then pulled a ruled ledger from beneath the counter. You have cash? Not much. June nodded. I know. Walter opened the ledger. He wrote her name slowly. $25 limit. You pay something every Saturday, even if it is 50 cents. Miss 2 Saturdays without telling me. Account closes. I can do that. No. You can try. Different thing. From beneath a stack of catalogues, he produced a stained paperback titled Home Repairs for Old Houses and slid it across the counter. June opened it. The pages still separated. Walter pointed toward the shelves with his pencil. Buy what keeps you alive first. What makes it pretty can wait. She left with a chimney brush for $4.85. 50 feet of rope for $2.10. A wire scraper for 65 cents. Stove cement for $1.35. A box of matches for 12 cents. And 2 pounds of roofing nails for $1.60. The prices frightened her less once written in Walter's ledger. Debt named plainly felt different from debt hidden in drawers. The chimney came first. June had found a small cast-iron stove in the front room, but when she opened its damper and held a match beneath the flue, the flame bent toward her instead of upward. She did not light a fire. Walter's book described the method plainly. Remove loose soot from below. Inspect the smoke shelf. Brush from the top downward. Catch everything before testing draft. June tied the chimney brush to the rope, climbed the roof by placing a borrowed ladder against the soundest section of eave, and sat astride the ridge because standing made the shingles move beneath her boots. She lowered the brush. It stopped after 4 feet. She pulled it up, turned it, lowered again. The blockage gave suddenly. A black column of creosote, soot, dried leaves, and part of an old bird nest dropped into the stovepipe below with a sound like gravel emptied from a bucket. June coughed despite the cloth tied across her mouth. For nearly 5 hours she worked the brush down, pulled it up, scraped the copper-black glaze she could reach near the crown, then repeated the motion until the rope burned a red groove across her palms. By late afternoon, she had filled most of a flour sack with debris. Inside, she disconnected the stovepipe and scraped another dense ridge from the elbow. One seam had opened enough to show daylight, so she pressed stove cement into it with a putty knife and waited until the following morning before testing anything. The first match flame leaned upward. June watched it for a long time. Then she built a fire no larger than 2 fists. Paper first. Dry splinters. 3 pieces of walnut deadfall. The stove ticked as it warmed. A faint ribbon of smoke escaped one joint, disappeared after the metal expanded, and did not return. By dusk, heat had reached the floor 6 feet away. June heated a dented saucepan of water, stirred in oats bought with 38 cents she had earned sweeping the back room of Doris Bell's cafe, and added half an apple Doris had placed beside the bowl without charging her. She ate sitting cross-legged on the floor. The oatmeal was too thin. It was also hot. She held the bowl between both palms until there was nothing left in it. The next morning she began the workroom inventory. Not everything deserved saving. Moisture had fused several rolls of tin plate into orange-edged cylinders. Mouse urine had ruined a box of paper patterns. One bench leg had rotted where rain crossed the floor, but some things had waited better. There were 7 hardwood-forming stakes, each with polished shoulders worn by metal drawn across them thousands of times. A pair of long-bladed tinner's snips hung beneath the bench, stiff at the pivot but not rusted through. She found 3 wooden pattern boards shaped like a dove, a leaping stag, and an 8-point star. A shallow drawer held dozens of curled tin strips already folded along one edge to make a safe rim. There was a hand-cranked beading machine with brass gears beneath the grime. A jar of sal ammoniac sat sealed by wax, and wrapped in oilcloth beneath the main bench lay a heavy copper soldering iron with a rectangular bit and an oak handle nearly 14 inches long. It was not the enormous iron she had noticed on her first evening. This one was usable. June cleaned one corner of the copper with wool until a muted rose colour appeared. Then she turned toward the larger iron. It lay on the rear bench where she had left it. The copper head was disproportionately heavy, perhaps a tool made for large seams or for holding heat through long work. Its iron shank entered an oak handle darkened almost black near the ferrule. June lifted it with both hands. Something was wrong. Not broken. Wrong. Elias had trained her hands to notice balance. A hammer whose head loosened by 1/16 of an inch felt different before it looked different. A tin snip with a twisted blade pulled the wrist before the eye found the twist. The soldering iron's handle was too heavy. June rested the copper head on the bench and tapped the oak with one fingernail. Solid. She tapped closer to the end. The sound changed. A short, dull note, then a lighter one. She turned the handle and tapped again. Hollow, June stood very still. The butt end appeared to be one piece of oak, but a narrow circular seam became visible when she rubbed it with a damp cloth. She tried her fingernail. Nothing. With the point of a sewing needle from her bag, she cleaned dirt from the seam until she could see a disc fitted precisely into the handle. Not oak. Cedar. The colour difference had vanished beneath decades of grime. June did not pry it immediately. She went outside, pumped water. washed her hands, came back. From the tool drawer, she chose the thinnest blade she trusted, wrapped its edge in cloth, and worked it beneath the cedar disc a fraction at a time. The disc rose less than 1/8 of an inch. She rotated the handle, worked again. No rushing. Old wood punished impatience. After nearly 20 minutes, the cedar plug came free into her palm. The cavity inside the oak handle extended farther than the needle could reach. June tipped it downward. Nothing came out. She looked inside with a candle. Something pale had been packed against the inner wall. She bent a length of soft wire into a tiny hook and drew out the first bundle. Oilcloth. Then another. And another. 6 narrow packages had been fitted end to end inside the hollow core. The last object resisted. June stopped pulling when she felt paper catch against wood. She rotated the iron and eased it loose by gravity until a small rectangular tin box slid into her hand. She placed everything in a row on the cleaned bench. The first oilcloth bundle contained 2 fine pattern snips, smaller than Elias's, their handles wrapped with dark cord. The second held 3 miniature hardwood stakes shaped for tight curves, a bird's throat, a horse's knee, the inner turn of what looked like a key. The third contained thin sheets of bright tin plate protected between waxed paper, nearly untouched by corrosion. In the fourth were folded design drafts. June opened only the top sheet. The drawing was unlike any cookie cutter she had seen. Instead of a single outline, it showed nested bends, raised interior forms, soldered bridges, and measurements marked to 30/2 of an inch. Another design beneath it seemed to form a 3-dimensional bird whose wing would emboss dough without cutting through it. She closed the packet carefully. The 5th bundle contained a cookie cutter shaped like an old-fashioned key. It was exquisitely made. The top edge had been rolled smooth. The teeth were sharply proportioned. A narrow reinforcement bridge crossed the bow without distorting the cutting edge. Someone had engraved words along the back plate by hand. Cut away the excess to find the shape that is truly yours. June traced the engraving once with her thumb. The 6th package was money. Old currency wrapped flat between pieces of muslin. June sat down. Only then did she open the tin box. Inside were more bills, paper rolls of coins, a small leather pouch, and an envelope sealed with yellowed wax. The envelope had no name on it. She did not touch the seal. Not yet. She carried the money to the front room, cleared the counter, washed it twice, dried it, and began counting. She counted once, then again, then a third time with each amount written in pencil on the back pages of Walter's repair manual. There were old paper notes in several denominations. There were Liberty Head nickels, Barber dimes, Standing Liberty quarters, and Morgan silver dollars wrapped in paper softened almost to cloth. The exact total was $21,400. June stared at the number, then counted the last packet again. It remained $21,400. At the bottom of the leather pouch lay a military medal suspended from a faded ribbon. The bronze had darkened around the edges. On the reverse was a name and the year 1918. June set it beside the unopened envelope. $21,400 could have bought heat, food, a room with a locking door. It could have paid someone else to climb the roof, repair the chimney, haul away the rotten boards. June did none of those things that night. She wrapped the money again exactly as she had found it and placed it inside an empty flour tin beside her sleeping place. The design drafts went beneath her folded coat. The medal remained on the counter. The letter stayed sealed. After dark, She carried a blanket outside and walked beyond the walnut trees to where a narrow creek crossed the lower edge of the property. Rain from the previous week had raised it against the stones. June sat on the bank. For 6 weeks she had measured every decision against hunger, distance, gold, and the number of coins left in her pocket. Now, a sum larger than anything she had ever possessed sat inside a rusted workshop behind her. She did not feel richer. She watched water divide around a half-submerged stone, join itself on the other side, and continue downstream. The envelope could wait until morning. Some things deserved daylight. Cut away the excess to find the shape that was truly yours. Morning entered through the cracked east window in a thin rectangle of pale light. June carried the sealed envelope from the counter to the stove, warmed her hands, and turned it over. Only then did she recognize the handwriting. Not the words. The hand. The narrow K. The long descending tail on the Y. The numbers written with open fours. She had seen them on Elias Keller's old pattern cards. June sat down before breaking the wax. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have already done something difficult. You looked closely at a thing most people considered finished. My name is Anna Riehl Keller. In September of 1988, at St. Joseph Hospital in Lancaster, Dr. Samuel Brenner told me I had pancreatic cancer and should measure my remaining time in months rather than years. I have lived long enough to know that a short measure can still hold careful work. This shop began with my great-grandfather Johannes Riehl, born in 1836 near Ephrata, who opened a tinsmith bench here in 1867 after learning the trade in Lancaster. His son, Amos Riehl, born in 1865, expanded the work into household tinware and shaped cutters sold through markets from Reading to York. Amos's daughter Clara Riehl, born in 1878, became the finest pattern maker in this family, though most customers believed her designs belonged to the men whose names were painted on the sign. Clara's daughter Ruth, my mother, born in 1903 in this house, taught me the work before I could properly reach the bench. 4 generations, and not one of us owned the metal we shaped. We only held it for a while. My husband, Daniel Keller, died in France in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne fighting. He had carried one of my small tin stars in the pocket of his uniform. The medal you found came home without him. I kept it because grief, like metal, should not be hammered every day. Sometimes it must simply be stored until another pair of hands can carry it. The trade here closed on October 17th, 1957. I cleaned the soldering bench that evening, banked the charcoal for the last time, and locked the front door. More than 30 years have passed in silence since then. If you intend to work the tin, remember what impatience ruins. Heat the copper soldering bit until sal ammoniac smokes cleanly, but the copper does not scale dark. For ordinary tin plate seams, mix 1 part zinc chloride flux with roughly 3 parts clean water and use less than you think you need. Hold a folded safety edge close to 1/8 inch whenever the hand will touch it. When annealing stubborn work, warm it evenly and stop before the surface loses its bright character. A soldered joint should be hot long enough for the solder to flow through the seam, not so long that it pulls like a careless apology. The patterns wrapped beside this letter were Clara's last experiments and some of mine. We tried to make cutters that did more than outline dough. We wanted the metal to press feather, window, leaf, and bone into the surface without cutting the shape apart. We failed often. Keep the failures. They show where the material refused a lie. There is a stone marker behind the shop, beneath the western walnut, carved with a small 8-point star. Daniel placed it there before he left for the war. We buried no body beneath it. It is only a place where a person may stand when the house becomes too full of memory. If money is still hidden with this letter, use it slowly. Inheritance is not permission to stop working. It is stored labor. Every dollar came from hands that cut, folded, soldered, repaired, saved, and went without something else. Spend only what helps the work continue. Leave something behind for a person whose name you will never know. There is one more thing. A shape does not become itself because you add more metal. You find it by deciding what must remain and what may be cut away. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. October 20, 1988. June reached the signature and did not move. The stove gave one small iron click. She read the letter again from the beginning. The second reading was slower. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, matching every weakened line exactly, and returned them to the envelope without resealing it. Then she opened the back door. The western walnut was the largest tree on the property. Its roots had lifted the earth in long ridges, and beneath a mat of wet leaves June found the top edge of a stone. She cleared it with both hands. The marker was no taller than a breadboard. There was no name. Only an 8-point star cut into the face and, beneath it, the date 1918. June sat back on her heels. A man had once stood here before crossing an ocean to a war from which he would not return. Someone else had kept the place for him. Not as a grave, as a direction. June stayed until her fingers became cold. Inside, she took the bent 6-pointed cutter that had belonged to Elias and cleaned it with a soft rag. One point had folded inward years before. She did not straighten it. From the oilcloth bundle she chose a tiny pierced tin candle lantern, blackened around its chimney but intact. She placed a stub of candle inside and struck a match. Pinholes cast small stars across the wall. For the first time, the workshop held light made by something crafted there before June was born. She began noticing, then, how survival had arrived in pieces too small to call rescue. The dairy farmer who had watched a stranger approach his barn and handed her a horse blanket without asking for proof of anything. Mrs. Hess, who had stamped a $3 deed and taken the time to open an old ledger because a surname sounded familiar. Walter Stoltzfus, pretending a stained repair manual had no value, so June could accept it without owing gratitude she could not repay. Doris Bell, placing half an apple beside a bowl of oatmeal and turning away before June could refuse it. None of them had changed her life alone. They had only moved one small weight when she could not. Perhaps you remember someone who once did that for you. Not a grand rescue, but one small kindness at the exact moment you needed it. A meal, a ride, a coat, a sentence spoken without judgment. What was it? And have you ever told anyone that you still remember? That evening June wrapped Anna's letter in clean cloth. She placed the old pattern drafts, the fine snips, the miniature stakes, the military medal, Elias's bent star, and the engraved key-shaped cutter beside her sleeping place. She did not put them back into hiding. For one night, they remained within reach. December 3 brought the first true snow, 7 inches by noon, heavy enough to expose every weakness in the roof. June stood in the front room with a saucepan beneath the northern leak and read the roofing chapter in Walter's repair manual 3 times before climbing the ladder. The workshop roof measured roughly 18 by 32 feet on each main slope, allowing for overlap, waste, and the damaged north edge. She calculated 22 squares of shingles, 2 rolls of felt, and nearly 40 pounds of nails if she replaced only the failing sections and preserved what remained sound. Walter checked her arithmetic without comment. Then he disappeared into the back room of the hardware store and returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle worn dark at the grip. "My brother's," he said. June looked at it. Walter set the hatchet on the counter. 2 days later, a man named Eli Zook arrived at the workshop wearing a wool cap patched over one ear. He had roofed barns and houses until arthritis bent 2 fingers permanently toward his palm. Walter had sent him. June offered payment before he climbed the ladder. Eli shook his head. He watched for 11 days. He also worked. The north edge required more than shingles. One rafter had split beside an old knot and sagged nearly an inch. Eli showed June how to sister it with a straight length of seasoned pine, clamp the pieces tight, and fasten through soundwood rather than trusting the cracked section. They snapped chalk lines so the courses would not wander. June learned to seat each roofing nail with 3 deliberate strokes. 1 to place, 1 to drive, 1 to finish flush. On the 4th morning, Eli tapped a shingle with 1 bent finger. That nail's proud. June raised the hatchet. She did. No argument. By the 9th day, her knees were bruised from roof boards and the skin beneath both thumbs had split despite gloves. Snow melted into her sleeves whenever the sun reached the ridge. Eli never praised speed. He praised alignment. He praised a nail driven exactly where the next shingle would cover it. When June tried to save a warped piece of old sheathing near the chimney, he pushed on it once with his boot. They replaced it. On December 15th, June climbed into the attic during a sleet storm and waited. No drops struck the buckets. She stayed there for 20 minutes, listening to weather move over the shingles instead of through them. Outside, Eli sharpened Walter's hatchet on a stone. He handed it back without ceremony. That was enough. By January, the chimney had become the next argument with winter. Several bricks above the roofline had spoiled so badly their faces could be brushed away with 2 fingers. Mortar between them had powdered into pale sand, and 1 corner of the crown moved visibly when June pressed it. She dismantled only what was unsound. Walter helped her choose replacement brick close in hardness to the original for the exterior joints. June mixed hydraulic lime mortar slowly, keeping the batch small enough to use before it stiffened. Around the hottest interior repairs, she blended fireclay into the refractory mortar at roughly 1 part fireclay to 3 parts prepared mix, just enough to improve heat resistance without turning the joints brittle. The work took nearly 3 weeks. Most mornings remained in the 20s. June wore gloves while carrying brick, but removed them to point the joints because she could feel pressure better with bare fingers. Every 15 minutes her fingertips went numb. She would climb down, hold both hands near the stove until pain returned as sharp needles, then climb again. The chimney revealed its history layer by layer. A patched lightning crack. A section rebuilt with brick from a different kiln. Soot stains where an earlier stovepipe had once entered the flue. June did not erase those differences. She made them sound in late January. After the mortar had cured long enough to trust, she built a small test fire. Paper. Kindling. 2 dry walnut splits. The smoke rose without hesitation. June went outside and watched the chimney. A thin grey column lifted straight into the winter air. No smoke leaked from the crown. No smell entered the attic. She placed 1 palm against the warm brick inside the shop. It held. The floors began in the final week of January, beneath decades of soot and grit. Much of the original flooring was white pine, wide planks fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails, whose black heads sat unevenly along the boards. June removed only sections too rotten to carry weight. She reset loose nails by hand, replaced missing boards with salvaged pine close in grain, then rented a random orbit sander from Walter for $14 per day. The machine was smaller than a floor drum sander and slower. That suited her. She worked in 3 passes, 80 grit first, enough to remove dirt and failing finish without flattening every scar, then 120, then 220 only where hands and bare feet would notice roughness. Dust entered everything, her sleeves, her hair, the folds of the letter kept safely inside the tin box. By evening, the floor looked almost colourless. Then the first oil coat went down. The change happened beneath the rag. What had appeared dull brown warmed into dark honey, and in the oldest boards that honey deepened toward mahogany where feet had crossed the same paths for generations. June applied 3 thin coats, wiping away every place the oil tried to pool. Then she left the floor untouched for 48 hours. On one bad morning between coats, she did no work. She had awakened before dawn with the old house in York inside her head, her father's piano, the red ceramic bowl, her mother folding the eviction notice. June put on her coat and walked to the marsh below the creek. A great blue heron stood there. It did nothing useful. It stood in shallow water for almost an hour, neck folded, grey body motionless while sleet gathered along the reeds. June sat beneath a sycamore and watched it. When the bird finally opened its wings and crossed the marsh, she went home. The floor could wait one day. By February, the windows made the workshop look blind. There were 8 altogether. 3 had no glass. 4 held cracked panes repaired with yellowed tape or old putty. The 8th contained one wavy original pane believed to date to 1788, thin and imperfect enough to bend reflections along its surface. June would not replace it. She removed that sash first, wrapped the pane in blankets, and stored it flat while she repaired the surrounding frame. For the others, Walter found salvage glass close in thickness to what had survived. June learned to bed each pane against a thin cushion of DAP 33 glazing putty rather than pressing glass directly onto dry wood. She set the glazing points carefully, then rolled putty into narrow ropes and pressed them along the edge with a warm knife, drawing one clean bevel that shed water outward. The sash cords were worse. Several had snapped years earlier, leaving counterweights stranded inside the pockets. June used 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. She threaded each cord over the pulley, lowered it into the pocket, tied a compact figure-8 knot around the counterweight eye, then tested the balance before closing the access panel. Too short and the sash would not rise. Too long and the weight struck the bottom. The correct length made an old window feel almost weightless. She learned by cutting 2 cords wrong. On the final window, afternoon sun entered while she seated the last intact pane. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch less than 3 feet from the glass. June stopped with the putty knife in her hand. The bird tilted its head once, through the old wavy pane. Its black cap bent slightly with the imperfections of the glass. Then it flew. June finished the bevel, wiped her knife, and lowered the sash. It stayed exactly where she left it. By late February, June could no longer ignore the plaster beside the chimney. 3 earlier patches had failed. The first cracked overnight. The second sagged away from the wall while still damp. The third held for 2 days before a hollow tap revealed that it had never bonded properly to the hand-split oak lath beneath. Walter gave her an old burlap bag of horsehair that had belonged to his brother. Been hanging upstairs 20 years, he said. Might as well earn its keep. June mixed lime plaster in small batches and worked the hair through it until the fibres separated instead of clumping. She dampened the old lath, pressed on a scratch coat, and scored it while still green so the next layer had something to grip. Then came a 3/8-inch brown coat. She left it alone for 72 hours. The final coat was barely 1/8 inch thick, drawn smooth with a steel trowel, until the repair followed the uneven character of the old wall instead of pretending to be new. June stood back. The patches were visible. That was right. She said it quietly. The wall gave no answer. People began appearing without announcing that they meant to help. Doris Bell came first. She was short, square-shouldered, and always wore a flower mark somewhere on her dark apron. Twice a week she left paper bags on the doorstep before opening the cafe. Bread heels. 2 eggs wrapped in newspaper. Sometimes soup in a canning jar. When June finally caught her setting one down, she held out money. Doris pushed June's hand away with the back of her wrist. In candles when the shop reopens. Then she walked back toward town before June could explain that she had no idea whether the shop would ever reopen. Caleb Martin arrived one Saturday on a red Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with a cowlick that refused his wool cap. Without asking, he began splitting the walnut rounds June had dragged from a fallen limb behind the workshop. After an hour, June offered him $2. He shook his head. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. He stacked the split wood bark side up and rode home before dark. Reverend Boyd passed the lane each morning on his walk from the parsonage to the church office. He had a silver beard trimmed so precisely it looked measured. At first he only tipped his hat. Later, whenever June happened to be outside, he stopped at the gate, removed the hat, and said the same 4 words. He never asked to come inside. The seller waited longer. June postponed it until February 11th because every repair above ground seemed more urgent than whatever darkness lay beneath it. The steps descended behind a narrow door in the workroom. 7 granite treads led to a 12 by 15-foot cellar with a fieldstone floor packed hard between the joints. Moisture silvered the lower walls, but the joists overhead remained sound. At the centre lay one dressed granite slab, unlike the rough stones around it. An 8-point craft mark had been carved into the surface. June swept it clean, then left it where it was. Some things could remain unanswered. Under the 3rd stair, however, her broom struck wood. A small oak box had been wedged deep behind the riser. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into an 8-point star. Beneath it was a tintype wrapped in linen. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the workshop in summer, bone hand resting on a tinsmith's stake. June brought it closer to the cellar window. The woman's mouth, her brow, even the slight, unequal height of her eyes. For one disorienting moment, June seemed to be looking at herself dressed in another century. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, Ruth Riehl, daughter of Clara, age 25, summer of 1903. June carried the photograph upstairs. The brass key went onto the mantel. She tried it in nothing. By March, snow retreated into grey ridges along the north side of the workshop. The creak became loud enough to hear from the back door. Walnut catkins lengthened against the branches, soft and green where winter had seemed permanent only weeks before. June made one deliberate decision. She would not begin Clara and Anna's full designs that spring. She was not ready. Instead, she chose $1 Morgan from the cash to exchange for ordinary materials and promised herself that everything she learned would first be tested on scrap. Small stars, simple birds, straight seams, edges folded until her fingers understood them without instruction. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, June completed the first cutter she was willing to place beside the old work. It was not elaborate. A running hair, 9 inches from nose to heel. She had formed the outer strip around a walnut stake she carved herself, folded the upper edge to protect the hand, then soldered the seam with such little excess that the joint almost disappeared. Inside, 2 shallow bridges pressed an ear line and the bend of a hind leg into dough without cutting through it. June baked 1 test cookie in Doris's cafe oven before dawn. When she lifted the cutter away, the animal remained whole, not perfect. Alive enough. She carried the cookie home wrapped in waxed paper and placed it beside Clara's drawings. The workshop had changed without becoming unrecognizable. The white pine floors still held scars. The repaired plaster showed faint differences in tone. 8 windows opened and closed. The front counter stood level again, its shallow drawers cleaned but still labelled in old handwriting. Above the soldering bench hung Elias's bent star. June had installed only what the building needed: safe wiring run discreetly along existing routes, a deep sink, proper ventilation over the soldering bench, and shelves made from pine salvaged during the roof repair. Nothing gleamed merely to prove it had been restored. The brass key remained unexplained until the following spring. June found the lock by accident. A storm had broken a dead limb from the western walnut, exposing an iron plate grown nearly flush with the trunk where bark had folded around it. The plate carried the same 8-point star as the key. June stood beneath the tree for several minutes before bringing the brass key from the mantel. It turned once. Behind the plate was a narrow copper-lined cavity. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, protected by waxed canvas, and a small note whose paper had browned almost to the colour of tea. The handwriting belonged to Ruth. June read it beneath the walnut tree. The note was dated October 4th, 1918, during the First World War. Daniel had already gone overseas. Ruth wrote that Clara had placed the flag there because Anna could not bear to keep it inside where every room reminded her of departure. If Daniel returned, they would take it out together. If he did not, it was to remain folded until someone in the family could unfold it without asking the dead to come home. June carried the flag inside. She did not unfold it that day. On November 11th, the anniversary of the armistice, she took Daniel Keller's medal to Greenwood Cemetery in Lancaster County, where his family marker stood beneath 2 old maples. There had never been a body beneath that stone. June placed the medal in a small archival case fixed behind the marker with permission from the cemetery caretaker. No speech was made. She stood there until the church bells finished striking 11. Of the 21,400 hidden inside the soldering iron, June used only 4 coins. 1 paid for her first practice sheets of tin plate. 1 helped buy fire brick. 1 covered glass for a window whose salvage pane failed during fitting. The 4th purchased solder and flux when she finally began making work intended to leave the shop. The rest she wrapped again, not in the old failing muslin, but in archival paper inside a sealed steel box. With it she placed Anna's letter, copies of Clara's designs, a record of every repair made to the property, and an envelope bearing 2 words, Th. Next One. She returned the box to the hollow beneath the great soldering iron's handle, then made a new cedar disc and fitted it without glue. The shop reopened so quietly that June almost missed the day it happened. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard, hand-marred tin cookie cutters. Repairs accepted. Ask for June at Riehl's old shop. No telephone number. No website. Within 3 months, more than 40 names had accumulated on a mailing list kept in a school composition book. Some wanted Christmas stars. Some sent damaged cutters that had belonged to grandmothers. One woman mailed a crushed rooster from Ohio and wrote only, "Please make him stand again." June repaired it. She charged enough to replace materials, heat the room, and pay Walter's old ledger balance. Nothing more. Caleb returned that autumn. He was taller, broad through the shoulders now, and drove a pickup instead of the red Schwinn. From the bed he lifted a hand-carved wooden sign wrapped in an old quilt. June leaned it against the front counter and pulled away the cloth. He had copied the original lettering exactly. IAAL Tin and Pattern and Works. Below it, in smaller letters, he had carved. June ran one finger through the new grooves. There were sons too, she said. Caleb nodded. June looked at him. He became interested in examining a crack in the floor. She laughed once. It surprised both of them. They hung the sign beneath the old one instead of replacing it. That winter, after closing the shop one evening, June took out a sheet of cream paper. She sharpened a pencil with Walter's old pocket knife, now hers after he stopped keeping regular hours at the store, and began a letter. My dear one, whoever you are. She paused, then continued. She wrote no instructions about deserving the property. No warning that the next person must preserve everything exactly as she had. Instead, she described which roof valley still required watching after hard rain, where the well pipe froze first, how to recognize overheated solder by the way the surface dulled. She wrote that the key-shaped cutter should never be sold because its worth was not in the tin. She wrote that Elias had once told a girl not to force metal past the shape it remembered. Then she told the truth about the $3, about sleeping on cardboard, about the first bowl of oatmeal, about a house that had not rescued her, but had given her enough walls to begin rescuing herself. She left several pages blank. The next person would have things to add. Late one December afternoon, snow began falling through the walnut branches. June stood at the workbench, shaping a narrow strip of tin around a wooden form. She trimmed one edge, tested the curve, trimmed again, cut away the excess to find the shape that was truly yours. The sentence had become less like advice over the years. It had become procedure. Outside, the new sign moved slightly in the wind beneath the old one. Inside, the stove settled into a low red heat while a row of unfinished stars waited beside the soldering bench. The tin cookie-cutter workshop waits. It has always waited. Back at the county annex, Margaret Hess eventually retired. Her replacement cleaned the desk and found, beneath the bottom drawer liner, an old $1 bill, Mrs. Hess had kept from June's $3 payment. A note was clipped to it. First dollar paid on the real place. Do not spend. So the bill remained in the drawer, waiting. 2.